Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mr. Salcedo's YouTube videos. Today, we're going to be talking about how cells grow. So, one of the characteristics of living things that we haven't talked about so far is that all living things grow. So, how does that happen? We're going to first talk, though, about something that normally isn't really talked about in bio, or at least I don't remember ever really talking about it. But in general, cells grow by increasing in size, right? So they can just get bigger. But there is a stopping point. We don't have crazy gigantic amoeba. We have pretty big amoeba, actually, but we don't have ones that are like our size. Why don't we have single-celled creatures that are gigantic like this? There has to be a reason. And so why do you think that is the case? So here's an actual amoeba, okay? And this one can actually get pretty big. But still, the biggest single-celled creature probably is going to be something that we can barely see with the naked eye. Maybe we'd still need to, I mean, like you definitely would still need to use a microscope if you wanted to see any detail on it. But there has to be a limit. So why does this happen? Well, there are two reasons. The first one is energy. It is much harder for a larger cell to get an adequate amount of nutrients, manufacture ATP, and remove waste. I always think of it as great. It's traffic. It's traffic time. The bigger the cell, the more complicated the transportation system needs to be. And if you need something and it takes forever for you to get to the other side of the cell in order to get it, that probably means the cell is going to die. Because eventually it's not going to be able to maintain homeostasis because it either isn't able to manufacture things fast enough or it isn't able to move nutrients like it's supposed to across the way. So that's why most creatures are multicellular creatures, right? Because it is easier instead to have these little tiny ones that are doing this and that can share instead of having just one gigantic one that could just die and then the entire organism is screwed. The other one is information. Even if we increase the size of the cell, DNA does not increase in size. And that means it becomes harder for DNA to send messages within the cell. And I always picture it like the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was huge, right? But if you are in Rome, how long is it going to take you to get a message to London? Forever. And that is also a death sentence, not just for an empire, but specifically for cells also, because that could be the difference between life and death of the cell. So instead, cells have a mechanism where when they get too large, they will start to divide, and they will divide into, you guessed it, two cells. And so here is a brief little clip of some cellular division.
New cells are formed by cell division, in which one cell splits to become two cells. Cell division involves two processes. In the first, called nuclear division, the nucleus divides. In the second process, cytokinesis, the cytoplasm divides, producing two cells.
And so you can kind of see in the video, actually, let me mute this. You can kind of see it in the video, though, that that process is literally the cell doubles in size first, and then it splits itself in half. So it's not really going to have that energy or information problem for very long because the division happens very quickly. All right, next. So all living things reproduce, right? Asexual reproduction is the first form of reproduction that we're going to be talking about, and it is the earliest evolutionarily that ever occurred. So that is the process of creating a genetically identical offspring from a single parent. And so these are hydra. And so you can see this little baby hydra is budding off of the side, and it is identical to the parent. And then eventually, when it grows big enough, it will just kind of pop off and land, and now you have another hydra. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, is the fusion of cells from two parents to create a genetically different offspring, right? A set of genetically different offspring. So normally they resemble the parents in some way, shape, or form phenotypically, but they are not identical. And again, there are pros and cons to both of these approaches. Because, right, if one of these was clearly better than the other, then all organisms on Earth would utilize it. But that isn't the case. So, depending on your situation and what type of environment you're in, it may be more advantageous to you to reproduce asexually versus sexually, or sexually versus asexually. It just depends. So, asexual reproduction, what are we typically talking about when we're talking about asexually reproductive creatures? Well, all single celled organisms reproduce asexually. What are the pros of that? The pros are the offspring are identical. And because they're identical, they tend to grow really, really quickly. Part of that is because they're tiny for the most part, but also there doesn't need to be a whole lot of development because they're identical to the parent. Cons: a lack of genetic diversity. You literally have identical Hydra. If this Hydra were put in an environment where all of a sudden it had to adapt to that change, if it was unable to adapt to the change, all of its identical offspring would also die, which means that this entire colony would die. And that would not be good if you're a Hydra, because all Hydra, especially whatever species this is, are identical. And so, like it says, if the environment changes, all those organisms might die. That is not very good. But it is maybe a possibility if you're in an area where environmental change is not a very big factor, right? If it's not a very big factor in the area, then great, asexual reproduction might be for you. Sexual reproduction, on the other hand, most plants and animals reproduce sexually. And you might think, what? Yeah, it gets weird, but there are examples of asexually reproductive animals that just make little clones of themselves. We'll talk about them when we do evolution and natural selection. They're kind of cool. And plants also kind of sometimes go through generational asexual reproduction and then sexual reproduction. It just depends on what type of plant we're looking at, right? So, pros, they're all genetically diverse. So, as a result of that, they tend to be better at adapting to changes. The con, though, tends to be that they grow slowly and that development takes more time. So, those are our pros and cons. If you have any questions, let me know.